Hey there, folks. Forrest Elder here, and today I'm going to be giving a sample lecture from the course I have designed. For my course, I decided to focus on one of my favorite historical topics, which is the First World War. I feel that, especially in the United States, the First World War is often overshadowed by the Second, and this I think is a real shame because it is the first that really paves the way to the Second, and they really shouldn't be treated in isolation from each other, in my opinion. Another thing that has been a personal complaint of mine when taking history classes on any given war is that they never seem to quite put it into the proper context. Many times in my experience, the class has briefly brushed over the events and setup of a war and simply gone straight into the fighting. And this has always left me feeling unsatisfied because I think the question of, well, why did this happen in the first place, is equally as important as the actual fighting of the war. With this in mind, I have tried to give sufficient time and material to explaining the origins of the First World War in the class I have designed. The topic from this lecture comes from the second week of the residential version of my course, sadly cut from the online version. It is entitled The Anglo-German Naval Race. Since the end of the Napoleonic War, Britain very much was the undisputed masters of the sea. And one of the methods that they used in order to keep this advantage was they had a doctrine called the two power standard. And basically, the two power standard meant that the Royal Navy had to be maintained at a level of at least as large as the next two largest navies combined. So in practice, if even the next two largest navies united against them, the Royal Navy would still have dominance. And traditionally what this meant is that the Royal Navy was maintained at a size uh, of the combined French and Russian navies, as those were the second and third largest navies for a very long time. And this was important, really, because the British Empire was very dependent upon global trade, not just for raw materials to feed their industry, but also food itself, because by this point in time, the population of Great Britain had risen to such a level that the domestic agriculture industry could not produce enough food for everyone living in Britain, and so food had to be imported. Therefore, it was of critical importance that the Royal Navy be able to defend all the trade lanes. The other strategy that the British Empire tended to pursue during this era was they tended to try and keep any single power in Europe from trying to gain too much power, and you can think of like Napoleon as an example of that. And so, because France was oftentimes the rival of Britain that Britain was trying to prevent from dominating the continent, the state of Prussia was oftentimes a very natural ally to Britain in this endeavor. And so the relationship between Prussia and Britain was actually quite friendly during the mid 19th century. But this would start to change in the 1850s as Germany underwent the Industrial Revolution. And again, in 1871, with the Franco-Prussian War and the unification of Germany, this really shook up the power dynamic in Europe at the time, as it essentially created a whole new great power overnight, basically. During this time, Queen Victoria was the monarch of Great Britain, and she was actually quite a Germanophile. And she really tried to pursue good relations with Prussia, and she had a plan, basically, to bring the new state of Germany into closer tie with England. And this plan involved marrying her oldest daughter, Victoria, to the Crown Prince of Germany, Frederick. And the thinking was at the time is that Frederick was also kind of an Anglophile himself, and he was very interested in liberal ideals. And being married to an Englishwoman, Queen Victoria felt that this would solidify the relationship between Britain and Germany. Well, unfortunately, Frederick and Victoria, their son, his name was Wilhelm II, and they really were not able to establish a positive parental relationship with him. And so Wilhelm really grew up kind of idolizing his grandfather, Wilhelm I of Germany, more than his father, Frederick. And in addition, he very much rejected a lot of the liberal ideology that his father was a proponent of. And at the time, the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, he would notice this, and he very much drew Wilhelm II kind of into his orbit and under his mentorship to try and steer him more in a direction of his grandfather's path rather than his father's. Well, also kind of during this time period, during the 1890s, a U.S. naval officer by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan, he wrote a very influential book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in this book, he argued that the state which controlled the seas controlled its own fate, whereas the nations that did not was automatically at the mercy of those who did. And so essentially what he was arguing is whoever can control the global trade lanes and really control global trade, that's who will dominate and be the dominant great power of the era. Well, Wilhelm II was a big fan of Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, and he really felt that Germany needed to take action to build its own fleet in order to protect its own trade lanes with its colonies and the importation of food and raw materials. Well, unfortunately, Frederick died before he took power, and so this meant that Frederick, Wilhelm II's father, was skipped in the line of succession, and Wilhelm II became the Kaiser of Germany. And around about the same time, Queen Victoria also died, and her son, Edward VII, which would be Wilhelm II's uncle, he took power in Britain. And so you had a situation where Wilhelm II was interested in building a navy, and Edward VII was very much not as favorable towards Germany as his mother had been. In fact, he was something of a Francophile, and he is often credited with drawing Britain and France closer together and leaving the traditional relationship between England and Prussia kind of by the wayside. And in the middle of all this, the German industry was really picking up. By the end of the 19th century, German steel production had already outpaced Britain, and its annual production of pig iron was not that far behind. And in 1897, Britain was the world's largest exporter of trade goods, and they exported 1,431.9 million US dollars in trade, whereas Germany was third, and they were exporting $865.13 million. And it was projected that if things remained constant, German exports, or the rate of growth that they were growing at, German exports would have overtaken that of American exports in 1916 and that of Britain in 1926. And the German Empire, very much like the British, they also depended upon the importation of raw materials and food. not only for their continued economic prosperity, but for their very survival as well. Because, like in Britain, Germany no longer produced enough food to actually feed its people anymore domestically. In 1907, former British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour would ominously declare in a side comment to the American ambassador that, and I will quote this, "We are probably fools for not no, we are probably fools not to find a reason for declaring war on Germany before she builds too many ships and takes away our trade." And so you have a situation where the British Empire and the German Empire are very dependent upon the trade lanes in order to keep themselves afloat and even just to feed their people. You have a German Kaiser who is reading the works of Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he's come to the conclusion that Germany needs a fleet in order to protect those trade lanes, whereas the British have the two power standard, and so they're trying to do the same thing. And you can see how these goals are similar, but they are incompatible. Well, during the German naval buildup, the argument between whether Germany should build cruisers or battleships came to a head. Wilhelm II was a proponent of building a fleet of cruisers in order to protect global trade, whereas his main admiral, von Tirpitz, was an advocate of building battleships because he really felt that because of this diametrically opposed policy of Britain and France, Tirpitz really believed that Britain and Germany would go to war at some point and that Germany needed battleships in order to protect its trade lanes. So in 1898, the first German naval bill was passed in the Reichstag by popular vote, and the German Navy went overnight from being a coastal defense force to really starting to build battleships to becoming a global power. And this, at first, this really wasn't, not too much attention was paid to this by the British because this first naval bill did not actually tip the scale of power. But in the year 1900, during the Boer War, uh, the German uh, political elite, they used the Boer War and the very uh, unpopular nature of that in Germany to pass a second naval bill. And this naval bill increased the size of the German Navy to larger than that of Russia. And so automatically this triggered the two power standard. Britain had to start building more ships in order to keep up with now Germany and France and to increase construction. And this triggered a naval race. And the Germans would do three more naval bills in 1906, 1908, and 1912, each increasing the size of the Navy. Well, the British, as a response to this, they also started to increase the size of their Navy. And they really had an advantage here because they had a comparative advantage in shipbuilding because they had, for hundreds of years, the Royal Navy had many shipyards with which you could depend upon, whereas Germany was starting from scratch. And then in 1906, the Royal Navy completed construction of a ship called the HMS Dreadnought. And this was a state-of-the-art battleship, and it really revolutionized naval warfare. It essentially made all ships before this obsolete. So you think of it as a super battleship. And what's impressive is they were able to build this in 14 months during the year of 1906. And so, of course, as soon as they were able, the Germans also started to try and build their own versions of the Dreadnought, and this further compounded the problem of the arms race. And finally, in 1909, an event happened which triggered an attempt at arms control. The Liberal Party of Britain had a very famous incident in 1909 in Parliament where they started to shout on the floor. The slogan was, "We want 8 and we won't wait." And what they were referring to is they wanted to build 8 new dreadnoughts that year. And this passed. And this was really a wake-up call for the Germans because they realized that they could not keep up with this level of naval construction. And so Alfred von Tirpitz and the British government, they began to have an attempt at an arms control treaty. The result of this is the Germans wanted to maintain their fleet at a 3-to-4 ratio to the British, so that would be 3 German battleships for 4 British ones. Whereas the British Liberal Party at the time, they would only accept a 3-to-2, so three British battleships to 2 German battleships. And neither side was ever willing to compromise on this. They would not budge from this. And thereafter, World War I started. And so kind of the end result of the Anglo-German naval race was that Germany was able to build a fleet that was large enough to scare the British Empire, but not actually large enough to really take control of the global trade lanes. And this would really haunt them in the war to come. All right, everyone. Hopefully some of that was interesting, and I look forward to seeing what you all think. Talk to you guys later.